Peter, thank you so much for being here with us. So we wanted to start by asking you how you got into qualitative research, and as you think about that, tell us about your dissertation project and how that developed.
Yeah, thanks, and really good to be with you here this morning, Wesley. I was in a graduate program in anthropology that started my interest in the qualitative side of things, and then when I was doing my doctoral program in ed policy and research, I worked as a grad assistant on a big evaluation project in Western Massachusetts and was able to undertake my own small-scale ethnography of inclusion practices in an urban middle school. And I just thought it was fascinating and engrossing and creative. And I really, really enjoyed the process, especially the data analysis and the writing, and I really enjoyed that. And then for my dissertation work, I went to Papua New Guinea and did work there on local conceptions of the usefulness of education in a climate of rising unemployment, rising educational credentialism. What does education mean in that context? Formal education, schooling. And there, one of the things that I learned in spending time with young people in the high schools was that they had real dilemmas about what education meant, especially for their own identities. And I learned that there was a whole kind of suite of behaviors and beliefs that they labeled as acting, quote, extra. And that term comes from the more or less egalitarian climate in Melanesia, where resources would be shared collectively. That has changed recently with modernization. And there have always been certain kinds of status differences between men and women and between big men and men. But these young people had real dilemmas about all this. And so, behaviors like wearing new clothing for young women, wearing makeup, speaking expensive English language, all these things, having aspirations to work in the cash sector, all of these could, cause you to be labeled acting extra. And so, actually, I've been speaking with Signithia Fordham about doing some ethnological work on dilemmas that many young people face about how certain kinds of school-related behaviors can be coded that way. But I realized that there are all kinds of other factors involved and criticisms of these sorts of typologies as well. So it's a complicated area, but that's what my dissertation work was on, and I've continued to be involved in that area doing more nonprofit development work in Papua New Guinea.
Great, thank you so much. Talk to us about how your ideas about ethnography have changed over time.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that in a few different ways. One, I think that's very important is, especially in the design and conceptualization of projects, is taking into account local problems. And so, sure, on the one hand, our topics are going to come from interests that we have, that come from our reading of literature and from theory and those kinds of things. But it's also very important, I think, once we begin to think about certain settings that we want to concentrate on, what is of local concern? What are people there grappling with? What are challenges that they are contending with? And to try to also take those up as part of our work. And so for me, that has a lot to do with making our work relevant. And I do think it's possible to do ethnographic work that has multiple purposes. And so I believe strongly in C. Wright Mills' guidance, and so Catherine Lutz, who I believe was on your committee at Carolina, she once told us all at a conference to be sure to read our C. Wright Mills, and I hadn't done that. And so sociological imagination on, and so this idea that you think about certain influences on your work. So there's available research and theory. There's your empirical data. There is your own background, your experiences, your commitments, your values as a researcher. And where all those meet would be where your unique contribution is. I would add local problems to that. And when you begin to think about local problems, that adds another component of relevance, and it especially makes you pay attention to how people on the ground in their everyday lives think about some of the problems that we're grappling with as researchers. And that's very important as well. And the local problems is also linked to Fred Erickson's call for us to try to scale down qualitative work and to try to capture how local educators and practitioners and leaders are innovating and addressing problems. And it's a way to honor their judgments. And I think that's very important for us as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because I know you've done a lot of work with educational leaders and with educators. Can you talk to us about how you've thought about your own ethnographic work and making it relevant for educators and for leaders in particular?
Yeah, so I think that, so here we're getting into, this whole area of, what constitutes science and scientific inquiry and scientific evidence, upon which policies and practices can be based. And I think that that's a very important issue, and I think it's an issue that all ethnographers really ought to grapple with and contend with. And I think that there are a couple of areas that we really need to be clear about. I think we still need to be, and I think you have a question more about the future in a bit, but I might go ahead and talk a little bit about that. I think we need to be very clear about the value of this kind of inquiry. And part of that starts with being very clear about the role of culture in educational processes, the role of culture in everyday life, and meaning construction, right? And so, Fred Erickson years ago at a conference, and he's been here, I know. Many people, I think, including education leaders, on some levels they're probably aware of this, but we need to constantly stress that people construct meanings, and these meanings are causal. They're causal in everyday life. They really do have a force to them, as James Peacock would say. And that is our realm, to try to capture that as ethnographers, and working in educational settings and schools to try to capture what that means for educational practices. So that's foundational to our work. I do think that in working with education leaders and teachers, practitioners, we need to be clear about the value of this kind of work. I think we need to be clearer about transferability, the role of concepts, the role of theory, the generalizability. So that all has to do with utility, right? And so I think we need to be more clear about that. And so our studies, we're trying to capture meaning making and everyday practices on the ground, but there are also implications for what we learn for other similar settings. And it's that leap to transferability that I think we need to be more clear about. And we also need to be more clear about what our findings mean for practice. And we need to work on translating findings. And you and I have talked about this in terms of translating findings in ways that are readily accessible, understandable, and useful for school leaders and policymakers. And that's work that I think is very, very important for qualitative researchers to engage with.
Can you talk a little more about that last bit and how you've done that in your work in Ohio or Minnesota?
So the translating part, yeah. And so later on today we're going to be together again with a group of students here, and I'll be talking about doing qualitative work that can be both critical and relevant, right? And I think that that's very important and very possible. So for example, a previous project I did in suburban Columbus, Ohio, one of the strong themes that came out of that was the degree to which these more affluent suburban students were acquiring psychological capital to prepare themselves for a neoliberal era. So to prepare themselves to compete, to prepare themselves for uncertain futures characterized by risk. And so that in itself is a kind of critical project. More recently, many of us are aware that there's been a lot of attention paid to non-cognitive factors associated with school success, grit, perseverance, school belonging, the notion that hard work pays off, academic mindsets. And so for me, one of the, I had it came to me a couple years ago that there was a very strong relationship between these two broad categories of psychological capital and academic mindsets. But it was important for me to move towards the academic mindset and grit categories, because those are more categories in use among the education research community and educational policymakers and practitioners as well. So huge, AERA session a couple of years ago with Angela Duckworth and Walton and all these people, Carol Dweck. And so I wrote a proposal for research funding at University of Minnesota and received a grant to undertake this kind of research. And actually the title of the proposal was addressing talent loss in the Twin Cities. And I think talent loss is an important way to think about how it is that many young people with great capabilities aren't able to succeed in school. And so at any rate, this was all about non-cognitive factors, but it was especially about how non-cognitive factors are acquired through sociocultural processes on the ground in everyday school life. And so one of the things I'm trying to do there, which I think is also uniquely ethnographic and qualitative in a way, is looking at the social construction of grit. And so I'm calling this a grounded grit project, and how it is that these academic mindsets shouldn't really be viewed as merely the accumulation of individual efforts, but they actually represent all kinds of social contact and relationships and local beliefs and efforts to build up young people and their capabilities. And so that's one important part of this. Another part of this that I'll talk about later today was wanting to, and this has to do with the local relevance as well, the school that I worked in over the last several years has struggled to implement an inclusion policy in the metro area, in the Twin Cities, like many schools have. And the policy is certainly the right direction in terms of trying to move many students who have been in self-contained classrooms into mainstream classrooms. And so there has been a movement to do that, but it happened very quickly without time for teachers to be trained as co-teaching teams, and also without time for these young people to be socialized into the regular comprehensive high school environment. And so they were moved from these self-contained classrooms into these regular classrooms, and that was difficult for a lot of these students. And all of a sudden also there's a huge range of reading levels in these classrooms, and a lot of these young people are frustrated. And so the people on the ground in the schools would say that they were, some of that frustration was getting acted out in hallways, which were increasingly chaotic. And a lot of teachers were getting very, very frustrated with this in the school, especially over the last 2 years. And some of them went to the press about it. And so there was and I'll talk about this later on today, and so there was an article that came out in a local newspaper in the metro area about the school's hallways. And it was racialized, and it was somewhat incendiary. And so it was very frustrating for other people in the school to see this, and to, in the words of the principal, the school was in some ways on fire. And so I had a commitment to the school, and this is part of that local problems part that I'm talking about in terms of where our work kind of gets its direction. And that all happened at the very end of the 2014-15 school year. That article came out at the end of May, and I felt compelled to write another article for, in one of these newspapers, online newspapers. The other one was an online newspaper and print, that provided another kind of perspective on the school and many of the positive things going on in the school. The school was identified as a beating the odds school in terms of getting so many students on college pathways, in terms of its remarkable trends in reading outcomes for students, especially English language learners, and you know all about this. And so I quickly, took pen to paper, sat at the keyboard, and wrote another article, and I titled it "Inside a Beating the Odds High School," and it came out on the last day of school. And I also talked about how many students in this school seem to be acquiring some of these non-cognitive factors associated with academic success, and here's how, and here's why. And so that ended up being a pretty positive thing to do. It just received a lot of support and some acclaim, a lot of views. It was the second most read article in that section of the newspaper the whole year and all this. And so, but that also involved writing in a different register, right? And I think that's also important for ethnographers to keep in mind that, look, we all have had all kinds of experiences, and we're all capable of writing and communicating in many different ways, with many different people for different purposes. So that's another, I think, really important message.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you to tell us about a generative mistake you've made as an ethnographer.
I love this question. Yeah, and I've actually thought that at my own university, we really ought to have a speaker series called something like "Mistakes That Were Made by Me and What I Learned from Them," right? Right. And so, that's another kind of non-cognitive factor, right? How do we learn from mistakes and failures, right? And it's so important. So here's one that I think about a lot, actually. And it was when I was preparing for dissertation research, and I was writing out my dissertation proposal at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And at the time, I was thinking about, I'd talked with some comparative educationists, including George Urch at UMass Amherst, about possible topics, and I knew I was interested in social influences on academic achievement. And one of the things George Urch had talked to me about was how, we have a pretty rich literature in the United States on the influence of peers on academic achievement, but we don't know as much about that in certain international contexts. And so I wrote up a proposal to study peer influence, mainly, other social influence as well, but peer influence especially, on academic outcomes in Manus Province, Papua New Guinea. So I went to see another faculty member in comparative education at UMass Amherst, and he had looked at my proposal beforehand. And we sat down, and he said, "I've read through your proposal, and I have one question for you." And he said, "How do you know peers exist in Papua New Guinea?" And I thought, what? Right. I have a graduate degree in anthropology. What are you talking about? And I could barely listen to the rest of what he said in this meeting because I was so irate and frustrated and upset. And I thought, he's questioning my whole proposal here, And then I left the meeting, with the perfunctory thank you. And I began to just think more about what he had said. Because what he had gone on to say, I began to realize, remember back, was that in a place like Papua New Guinea, social influences are much more complex than just friendship and family. Their kinship terminology is much more elaborated than here in the United States, where we have much more of a truncated kind of kinship structure, as you know. And so, for example, a third cousin, a second cousin could have, those would have specific kinship names and entailments and responsibilities and certain kinds of influence on a person. So how exactly are you going to characterize that as peer or non-peer, right? And so I began to think, he's right. He's right. And that was really important for me to realize that, and then to move on and to problematize some of my research questions so I could kind of capture that complexity and that nuance.
Yeah. think that's a real dilemma that so many of us face. When is our analytical category acceptable even when people we're working with are using different terms, and when is it simply inappropriate?
Yes.
It's so far from the way they're seeing and categorizing the world that it's simply not relevant, right? Yeah,
Right.
It's one of those examples.
It's huge.
Right, thank you. Okay, I have 2 more questions for you. The first one is, what do you wish you had known about doing qualitative research when you were in grad school that you didn't learn until later in your career?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, a lot of anthropology programs kind of go light on the methods courses. You know, we know that. And I think one of the good things about schools and colleges of education is that, I mean, many of our colleges and schools of education have pretty good explicit coursework in qualitative methodology, which is a good thing. And I think in anthropology programs, there's kind of this assumption that you just gotta get out and do it, right? Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've learned, and I think you've probably learned too, and a lot of us have learned, is that you will learn a great deal in the doing. You know, you'll learn a great deal in the doing. But you kind of have to have confidence that you're going to be learning things throughout the course of your project, and that the learning is going to be generative, right? And I think one of the hardest things for people that don't do qualitative work to understand about qualitative work is the emergent nature of our designs. You know, and that indeed we are going to learn things in the course of our data collection that we hadn't anticipated, and that's a good thing.
That's
right?
the point, right?
That's the point, and that, but that can create quite a lot of discomfort, unease, uncertainty. And so, you know, the emergent nature of our designs is something that you kind of only really learn, and it kind of only hits home once you experience it. You know, when you begin to see patterns, but then you begin to talk to people that don't fit this pattern, you realize this is a negative case, you know, and I have to pursue this, and moreover, I have to adjust my research questions so I can go down this pathway that this person is taking me down that I hadn't anticipated. And that's really important, and that's the kind of thing that you only, I think for a lot of us, only hits home once you have that experience. And part of it is also, I think, in a lot of our projects that, you know, you tend to learn more towards the end of a project, once your relationships have deepened and you've established more trustworthy participant relationships with people. And trying to get to that point, you know, it can take a while, and just the things we do to establish relationships, to be helpful, to be reciprocal, to do things, to take on roles that other people carve out for us. I mean, that all is part of the process. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to ask a short follow-up to that. Is there anything you've learned specifically about data analysis that you wish you had known back during the dissertation? I know you've done a lot of work in the area of data analysis.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helps, and you and I, you know, we've talked a lot about data analysis and interpretation over the years, and I really respect the way that you go about that. You know, I really do think it's helpful to think about moving back and forth between your data and available theory in literature. And that, again, is something that I've learned, I think, over time, is kind of, you know, tacking back and forth, you know, that is one metaphor for this, you know, into, as you're trying to move into the wind if you're in a sailboat, between the emic and the etic points of view. And I think that is a very generative and creative process. And so, you know, so for me, in terms of the work that I did in suburban Ohio, you know, using important concepts like Foucault on governmentality and techniques of the self, you know, Bourdieu's theory of capital, psychological capital, Sherry Ortner, and then elaborating that given the data that I've collected. And so, and that's where I think, you know, again, a unique contribution can come from, is trying to synthesize what you have learned through the voices and experiences of your participants with, you know, available theory, but then conceptualizing, you know. And so, for example, hyper-credentialing, another concept that came out of that as well. And that's where, you know, you and I know this. I mean, a lot of our contributions lie, you know, so your notion, you know, with Ofelia Garcia of additive schooling, I mean, that's a very powerful, important concept, and it's concise. And that's the kind of contribution that qualitative researchers can make to the broader world of educational practice and policy.
Thank you for that. Okay, one last question. What do you see as the future of qualitative research in education? What do you think are some of the areas where we need to move more quickly or develop more robustly, or what do you think are the possibilities for us qualitative researchers in this field?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I've touched on that a little bit. I think we do need to be more responsive to local needs, and to be more clear about what we can bring, to what we can contribute, to what we can learn about how policies, for example, actually unfold on the ground when they're implemented. So the whole area of policy localization. And policy localization yields, ethnographic surprises. It does. And that's for us to capture and to explain. And that's also a part of this movement towards scaling down. And I think we have to make a case for why that's important. And to me, again, it's important for many different reasons. These are the tools that we have, the qualitative suite of the tools and analytical techniques. These are the tools that we have, and this has been said before, to try to understand heterogeneous, unstable context. These are the tools we have. But I think we still need to do a better job of clarifying how we use them and what they can do, and perhaps even to adapt our own time scales to match up with those of people in schools and the policy world, right? So Jeff Wofford, years ago from Oxford, gave a paper on policy ethnography, and he talked about blitzkrieg ethnography. What do we do when policy moves fast and ethnography moves slow, right? I think that's a real challenge.
That is a very serious challenge.
Yeah, but some of that has to do with our language. Again, and going back to our registers, right? And being able to, like as Norma Gonzalez would say, take schools and education systems as crucibles for our work, right? And always to pay attention to those connections to the local worlds of practice and policy, and to try to be attentive to them and to try to be responsive to them, and most of all to try to be useful.
Absolutely. So one of the things that really strikes me about your work is that we've been through this period when some anthropologists have advocated just getting rid of the culture concept entirely, that it's a bankrupt concept, that it's colonialist or racist, or and others have argued that it's essential, that without it we lose attention to meaning making, and we may need to recast it in certain ways. Brian Street once said we need to think of culture as a verb. A lot of people have talked about cultural production. So with that as background, one of the things that strikes me about your work is how you are so attentive to cultural processes, to processes of meaning making, and as you said, meaning making as, I wrote it down here, meanings are causal. Tell us a little bit about how you think about the culture concept. To what extent have you needed to renovate it to do the work you're doing? And what is it about the concept that we need to hang on to, in your opinion?
I really appreciate the question. Okay, a couple things. I would say, first of all, that sure, the culture concept is misused, not used accurately all the time, right? But here in schools and colleges of education, I don't think we want to be too. I mean, who's going to be the culture police? We don't want to be in that position, right? I think we kind of have to be kind of gentle if we want to preserve its use. So just quickly, so some of the the uses of culture that make me uncomfortable, and perhaps a lot of anthropologists of education, And I think Brad Levinson actually talks about these quite succinctly in the introduction to Schooling the Symbolic Animal. And it's mainly more the bounded notion of culture, right? So the bounded notion of cultural groups, right? So it's he refers to this as the billiard ball conception of culture, that cultural groups, they're often conceived of as billiard balls that bounce off each other. They have discrete boundaries, right? And the example he gives is, so how much culture, really, does a department store manager in Buenos Aires and a department store manager in, I believe, Osaka, how much culture do they actually share? Quite a bit, actually, you know? But that takes us then into this other realm, right, of cultural meanings, beliefs, practices. And I do think that that use of culture does have legs, you know? And so to be honest, I think, you know, I've been moving more into this area of education leadership and school improvement. And that's been pretty exciting. It's taken me a while. You know, I consider myself a student of school improvement and education leadership, you know? And there in that literature, you still see the more kind of bounded notion of culture, school cultures, improvement cultures, right? And some of that makes me uncomfortable, right? But I do think that there's something very, very crucial about shared meanings around schooling, shared meanings around students. And we were talking about this earlier. If I was going to just start a school, and one of the things I've learned in my work in the Metro, recently in the Twin Cities Metro, is just the crucial importance of shared meanings around student capabilities, you know? So, and the school leaders that I've worked with there, especially the principal at one high school, he protects that meaning in almost everything that he does. He does. And that is, it's a meaning, it's a shared meaning. What are we going to call that, you know? And I think that gradually over time, you know, if you look at the use of culture over time, I think that there has been some gradual learning, you know, and in terms of how it is used. But I think that still in terms of shared meanings, messages, beliefs, practices, you know, it's a way to talk about how people in schools do things collectively or not, how they might dissent from things. One of the questions I've asked teachers over the last couple of years, what are some things that, you know, if a new teacher came into this school, what are some things that they might say that would cause other teachers to say, that's not quite the way we do things here, or that's not the way we talk about students or parents or teachers here. So what is that stuff, right? That's the stuff. So I think that, you know, one of the things I'm moving towards and working with some other colleagues on is thinking about how is school improvement culture developed and maintained? School improvement culture. And so I'm hoping that that's a notion that, you know, can be further elaborated over time.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
Really
Great to be here with
appreciate
you. Thank you.
Wonderful.